Hello, I would like to welcome you today to our digital event China's role in the civil war in Myanmar, a look at the current situation and possible developments. This event is being organized by the Lower Saxony and Bremen Regional Office of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation and of the Rudolf von Bennigsen Foundation, the Liberal Regional Foundation in Lower Saxony. My name is Jessica Buchmann, and I will be moderating this discussion today. I would like to start by saying that if you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A box at the bottom right of the screen, and we will answer them at the end of our discussion. Yes, today we want to talk about a conflict that has been pushed into the background due to all of the current events around the world, but it's still there and it's still important to talk about it. It's the civil war in Myanmar. There was a military coup in 2021, and since then there has been a civil war and a state of emergency, which is being fought militarily and brutally. Today, we want to talk about a bit about the warring parties in the country and what goals they are pursuing, but also about a party that's interfering from the outside and pursuing its very own agenda, namely China. Myanmar is an important factor in China's economic strategy in the region, for example, because of its access to important raw materials and energy and its access to the Indian Ocean. But can and will use China its influence on Myanmar to work towards an end to the war? We want to discuss this and many other questions today with two experts that we have invited for you. Our first guest is Ninh Nguyen Naing. She has been working for the Friedrich Naumann Foundation in Myanmar since 2017. Previously, she worked on projects on education, freedom of information, and private-public engagement in ceasefire-affected areas of Myanmar. And she has an academic background in political science, economics, diplomacy, and psychology. Welcome to you, Ninh. And our second guest is Dr. Felix Hajduk. He is head of the Asia Research Group at the German Institute of International and Security Affairs in Berlin. He conducts research on various aspects of foreign and security policy in Southeast Asia, in particular interstate and intra-state conflicts in Southeast Asia, the geopolitics of the region, civil-military relations, and ASEAN and its role in regional integration processes. Also, a warm welcome to you, Mr. Hajduk.
Thank you so much for having me.
I already want to start this discussion with a question to Ninh. Ninh, could you first of all tell us again what happened in Myanmar in 2021 during the military coup and how the civil war there broke out as a result of this?
Yes, thank you, Jessica. So what happened in Myanmar in early 2021 was a major turning point. On February 1st, the military staged a coup d'etat, removing the democratically elected government, led by the National League for Democracy. The military claimed that the 2020 general election had been rigged, claims that were widely rejected by independent observers, both local and international, I'll say. Following the coup, people across the country began to protest peacefully. So for about a month, I guess, we saw a remarkable show of unity from the public. People from all walks of life came out to reject the military's actions and call for the restoration of democracy. But that period of peaceful protest didn't last. The military began responding with increasing violence, open fires on crowds, mass arrests, and nighttime raids on homes. The situation became extremely dangerous, especially for young people who had taken leadership roles in the protest. Many of them are from Generation Z. They had grown up during a period when some democratic space existed. So they had access to the internet, to global ideas, and experienced a degree of freedom. So when the military took that away overnight, it felt like their entire world had collapsed. They went from living in a semi-open society to an authoritarian one. And many simply didn't know how to process that loss. Faced with ongoing crackdowns, a number of these young people had no choice but to flee, and many eventually joined armed resistance groups. For them, this struggle is about more than just politics. It's about justice and freedom, the two values that have become rallying points for the wider resistance across the country. Before I move on to your second question about the civil war, I think it is important to clarify one thing. Myanmar has been in a state of civil war since 1948. We have the longest civil war in the world. This civil war isn't something new. Even during the democratic transition period, conflict never truly ended. What changed was the intensity. The violence may have decreased in some areas during the NLD government, but the underlying conflict remained. What happened after the February 2021 coup, however, was a dramatic escalation. The violence spread in both scope and scale. Many young people, especially from urban areas who had never experienced armed conflict before, felt they had no other option but to resist. Some joined existing ethnic armed organizations, while others formed new resistant units determined to fight back against the military regime. Historically, civil war in Myanmar was concentrated in the border areas, region near China, Thailand, and Bangladesh, largely involved ethnic minorities fighting for autonomy. But post-coup, what's new is that armed conflict has expanded into central Myanmar, the so-called heartland, which had never been a battleground before. So this is a significant shift. Another key turning point was that what's now referred to as the October Revolutions or Operation 1027, launched in late October 2023 in northern Shan State near the China border. It marked one of the largest and most coordinated offensives against the military in recent history. The military lost control over significant territory from then onwards until now. And that's momentum spread. And the Arakan army in Rakhine State also launched major offensives, capturing strategic areas that the military has yet to reclaim. So to sum up, Myanmar civil war isn't new, but its geography, actors, and intensity have changed profoundly since the coup. What we are seeing now is a much broader, more unifying armed resistance that cuts across ethnic and regional lines with the goal of dismantling the military rule once and for all.
Thank you, Nin. Since you're in Myanmar, I hope we will still find some time in this discussion. Maybe you can tell us some about your personal experiences in Myanmar right now, what you've experienced during the civil war so far. But first of all, I want to continue with Dr. Hajduk. As I have already mentioned in my introduction, China has major interests in this conflict. Could you tell us what China's interests in Myanmar are and what agenda China is pursuing and why the country is so important for China?
Sure. I would like to start with the observation that the framing that is often used as in democracy versus autocracy, and China being essentially on the side of autocratic, authoritarian forces in its engagement and relations with Myanmar, I think is ill-suited to really make sense of China's relations and engagement in Myanmar, also with regards to its post-coup engagement in Myanmar. I think it's a nice binary frame, and it makes things very black and white. But the reality, at least how I see it, is a bit more complicated. Why am I saying this? Well, first and foremost, I'm saying this because in my interpretation, the engagement is really not so much ideologically motivated at all. China has in the past and still continues to this day, has engaged with the military, the Tatmadaw, has engaged also with the post-coup with the junta for sure, is, for example, still one of the biggest arms suppliers, but has also engaged at the same time with various ethnic armed organizations, especially in the north and in the east of the country, and has also engaged prior to the coup with the NLD-led government led by Aung San Suu Kyi. So to say that it's basically that we can make sense of China's engagement with Myanmar in this kind of democracy versus autocracy frame, to me, makes little sense. I would argue China's interests are mainly strategic on the one hand and geo-economic on the other, and not so much ideologically motivated. It doesn't really matter all that much who's basically in charge in Myanmar, whether it's the NLD or the NUG now, or the junta or any other. China will find a fairly pragmatic approach to engage. However, I think what's important is to keep in mind that the real framework, I think, to make sense of it is A, China's strategic interests, and B, China's geo-economic interests. What do I mean by that? Just very briefly, strategic interest, I'd say, is basically avoid spillover effects of the civil wars in Myanmar into China, be it violence spilling over, be it the adverse effects of illicit economic activities in northern Myanmar along the border spilling over, or general insecurity along the border. Strategic interest of China also include maintaining its access to the Indian Ocean that you, Ms. Buchmann, already mentioned in the introduction. And then that's coupled and interlinked to some extent also with very concrete geo-economic interests. China remains a main trading and investment partner of Myanmar, and the situation that has unfolded post-coup, especially the civil war spreading also to the heartlands, as Nin has already alluded to, has made these economic activities much more complicated. So there's also, again, this is then linked back to its strategic interest of maintaining this somewhat stable environment for its business and trade and investment interest. And the geo-economic interests also extend to large infrastructure investments. For example, China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, deep sea port, pipelines, high-speed rail links, and others, especially connecting southern China and Myanmar. And then last but not least, you also have rare earth and natural resources. China has now a virtual monopoly in the rare earth sector. It's dominating essentially the entire supply chain from the extraction of rare earths to their processing and manufacturing. And certain heavy rare earths are exported to China from northern Myanmar. So that's another key geo-economic interest, to maintain access to these exports that basically helps us frame and understand China's engagement with Myanmar post-coup especially. So in my view, to sum it up, the binary framing democracy versus autocracy doesn't really help us make all that much sense. I would say, or I would argue, the main interest are actually is a combination of strategic and geo-economic interests that basically help us make sense of how China engages with Myanmar or has engaged with Myanmar over the last 4 or 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you. You have already put forward something that I wanted to ask Nin in the next question, which would have been about the framing of democracy versus autocratic structures, actually. But I still want to touch upon that topic again. Nin, at the moment, China is supporting the military junta in Myanmar right now, which has become an increasing problem, or the junta has become an increasing problem also for China, because it creates so much instability in Myanmar. So actually, my framing would have been democracy versus autocracy, but as Dr. Hajduk already touched upon this, it's not a proper framing for this, but still, What is your thoughts about this topic, China supporting the junta in Myanmar, and what's the interest of explicitly supporting the junta and not civil society?
Yes, thank you. So China has the history of backing Myanmar's military, but I think it is clear that Beijing doesn't really care whether Myanmar is governed democratically or under authoritarian rule, as Dr. Haiduk has mentioned. What matters most to China is its strategic, economic, and geopolitical interests are protected or not. They are pragmatic. They'll work with whoever's in power as long as their priorities are secure. So we've seen this during the NLD government as well. President Xi Jinping met with Aung San Suu Kyi multiple times, including a high-profile visits in 2020, just a year before the coup. Since the coup, he has only met the junta once, and even that was not a bilateral visit, but a brief meeting on the sidelines of a summit in Moscow. So if you want to assess where the relationship really stands, I think those visits speaks volumes. At the core, China prioritizes stability only when it serves its interest. That includes the protection of its Belt and Road Initiative projects like the oil and gas pipelines, special economic zones, as well as maintaining a buffer zone along its border with Myanmar. It's not about supporting peace for peace sake. It's about safeguarding Chinese assets and regional influence. Now, if we look at what happened after the 2021 coup, China didn't rush to support the junta, nor did it condemn them openly. Instead, it stalled, it waited. Why? Because the military wasn't exactly cooperative with Beijing either initially. There was distress on both sides, and that tension became more obvious with Operation 1027 in 2023 because ethnic armed groups launched the attack on the military in northern Shan state to crack down on cyber scam syndicates. That's what they mentioned. Many of these online scamming centers are targeting Chinese citizens from Myanmar side. Beijing actually had asked the junta to take action against these operations, but the military refused to take action. So China stayed quiet when the ethnic armed organizations attack Myanmar's military under that claim. Ethnic groups were just being smart who used this justification to eradicate online scammers in their attack against the military near the border. Many in Myanmar actually thought at that time for a moment that, China was supporting the revolution now, simply because they didn't step in to stop the offensive like they used to. But what actually happened was much more calculated. China remained silent until the operation expanded beyond its initial objectives and started threatening Chinese investments and border stability. That's when Beijing stepped in. By that time, the junta had softened its tone. They began arresting scam operators, even allowed Chinese police to conduct arrests in border towns. Shortly after, recently as well, they enacted laws allowing foreign private security firms, widely believed to be Chinese, to operate in Myanmar to protect Chinese business interests directly. In return, China helped mediate between the military and ethnic armed groups in northern Shan, pushing for limited peace to protect their own stakes. So we see a clear pattern here. China isn't controlling the junta outright, but it's applying pressure indirectly and quietly, always positioning itself to safeguard its interests. At the end of the day, the China-junta relationship is not about ideology, like Dr. Haiduk has mentioned. It's transactional. And Beijing is very good at pulling strings from behind the curtain to shape the behavior of the junta, I will say. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, when you go back a couple of years in the media, there were big discussions from the experts about this topic, where they were still discussing that China could possibly actually switch sides still, because, as I already mentioned, the junta was increasingly causing instability in Myanmar. But at the end of last year, however, it was then reported that China and the military junta had the security firms that you have already mentioned, which have become an increasing target. And from then on, it looked like that China's support for the military junta has become more permanent. So the question, Mr. Hajduk, is this deceptive, or is the support of China for the military junta more of a fixed setting right now?
I think I'd concur with what Nin said, that in many ways it's a very transactional sort of relationship. I think you're right. At the moment, or I would say over the last year and a half, we've seen observable changes in China's relations with the junta, in at least I would argue three ways. First, at the diplomatic level, bilateral diplomatic level, Min Aung at the end of 2024 made his first official state visit to China since the coup. He didn't meet Xi Jinping. That was only in St. Petersburg, as Nin rightly pointed out, on the sidelines of a multilateral summit, actually. But he met the Prime Minister in Kunming, and he also attended the Greater Mekong Sub-Region Summit there in China. And then also the meeting in Moscow, was not St. Petersburg, in Moscow. And then also over the last year and a half, 2 years, you had various meetings at ministerial level. Chinese foreign minister, defense minister, and others visiting Myanmar, and also Burmese officials visiting China. So that has definitely increased over the last 1 year and a half, roughly, maybe a bit longer even. And that's a change in comparison to the 2.5 years right after the coup, where bilateral relations hadn't really picked up all that much. The second kind of area where I see changes is how China engages the junta at international forums, such as the UN, but also such as ASEAN and ASEAN Plus formats, where China now very, very openly emphasizes Myanmar's sovereignty, opposes sanctions, opposes the further international isolation of the junta, and so on and so forth. And also with regards to ASEAN, one more thing I'd like to say is that whereas high-ranking junta officials are still banned from attending high-level ASEAN multilateral forums, that China has kind of tried to circumvent that by enabling their participation in multilateral forums such as the Mekong Summit and others. And then the last area where I think we've seen changes in how China engages with the junta is the issue of the planned elections, where for a long time China sat on the fence with regards to that issue. That is heavily criticized by many ASEAN countries, by the opposition, of course, and by also many Western countries. Holding elections right now in late 2025 or early 2026 would basically be sham elections. All opposition parties are currently barred from participating, and so on and so forth. And China has basically sat on the fence for quite some time. But recently, there's also change in China's position for potential elections, in that the official position now is that there is support from Beijing for the junta's planned elections, and also the census that is planned prior to the elections. And also, according to recent media reports, China has also officially pledged financial and technical support to the junta to conduct the census and also to conduct elections, emphasizing that China now sees the holding of elections in Myanmar 2025 or 2026 as like an quote-unquote internal matter, and that China also rejects any quote-unquote external interference in the elections. So I think these three areas we've seen changes. However, is that tantamount with open and lasting sustainable support for the Min Aung Hlaing-led junta? I have my doubts, because some observers argue, and I think it's a plausible argument, that this could also be a way for Beijing to change the balance of power within the junta vis-a-vis elections, and actually to weaken the power position of Min Aung Hlaing and to bring somebody to the top, or have somebody emerge at the top that is not so, in China's views, not such an unreliable partner as Min Aung Hlaing is apparently, as far as I know, or kind of unofficially regarded as by at least Chinese observers. Yeah.
I still want to touch upon that topic again that you just mentioned, Mr. Hajduk, about the elections that are being held this year or next year. I wanted to ask Nin also about these elections, because like Beijing saw, I didn't quite understand in Mr. Hajduk's answer right now, if Beijing saw a possibility in these elections in diffusing the conflict or not. Maybe you could touch upon this topic as well, if this is a diffusing like option for this conflict in China's eyes. Yeah, and do you think that if it is or if it's not, this is a like strategy that China will pursue further in Myanmar with the elections?
Yes. China has been quietly but consistently pushing the military junta in Myanmar to hold elections. Many of the high-level visits, like Dr. Hajduk has mentioned, they actually, talk about the elections and how to hold the elections in conflict areas, because nowadays more and more areas have conflict, active conflict taking place. So because of those, the junta has delayed the elections multiple times, mostly because of its weakening positions on the battlefield. But eventually, they will have to comply to China, and China is one of the main actors nudging them in that direction. So from Beijing perspective, I think there are two main reasons behind this push. First, probably China sees elections, even the flawed ones, as a way to bring back a civilian face to governance. Whether that face belongs to former generals, either Min Aung Hlaing or someone from his administration in civilian clothes, or loyal politicians, it is still more presentable than openly supporting the military dictatorship, which has the outright oppositions from the whole Myanmar, and openly and then consistently supporting a military figure, which the country has hated, the whole country has hated, can bring the dangers to Chinese businesses as well. Again, this is sort of like the strategic calculation. Elections can provide a cover for legitimacy, and that makes it easier for China to maintain relations without drawing the criticisms from international as well as from some of the local businesses as well. Secondly, China wants to elevate its image as a regional peacemaker, I guess. Min Aung Hlaing has never listened to anyone. So I think in 2022, Cambodian Prime Minister, then Prime Minister Han Sen visited Myanmar and tried to negotiate with Min Aung Hlaing, and he thought he had won and then went back home, but then he was embarrassed because nothing happens. So for China, Myanmar is in its backyard, and then the prolonged conflicts affects China's infrastructure investments, border security, and broader strategic influence as well. So by facilitating and transition, China get to say to the world that, oh, we can stabilize what others cannot. See, we can be a regional peacemaker too. That's a good public image that they want to display as well. What's important to note is that China isn't only engaging the military in their plan. They have been meeting with political parties, holding consultations and preparing them, I'll say, indoctrinating them for a post-conflict political order. There have already been several occasions where political parties from Myanmar were invited to China for political dialogue. Most notably, former President Thein Sein was even invited. And recently, the head of the pro-military party, USDP, King, was invited to China, which signals that China is not just relying on the junta. Peace talks were held between the junta and ethnic armed groups, as well as bilateral talks between China and ethnic armed groups as well. So China is laying groundwork with multiple stakeholders to shape the future political landscape of Myanmar. And then what I see is that China is intensifying these ads in 2025. But when China say oh, Myanmar should hold the election, they are not just pushing in words, or they are not just holding consultation. They are literally helping the junta on the ground as well. For example, they have introduced e-voting systems, and then they also supported the technology to help open polling stations in conflict zones using models they have already tested with civil servants in Naypyidaw and Mandalay. So this shows that China is not just pushing for elections in theory, they are trying to make it happen in practice. So yes, this election strategy is moving forward unless there's another major disruption like Operation 1027 or a severe natural disaster. We can expect that the junta to announce its election plan, possibly by the end of the year. It may not be free and fair, but it will be structured in a way that suits China's long-term interests. A stable, compliant Myanmar, maybe, that doesn't embarrass Beijing on the international stage.
Thank you so much, Nin. I would like to close this topic for now and move on to another topic, which is also interesting in terms of not internally, but also externally in foreign relations. Mr. Hajduk, I want to go on to a topic that now with China that's more and now apparently more supportive of the junta, as we've already discussed right now. People fear that Myanmar will become more of a proxy arena for the US-China rivalry that exists. And there was an article from the Stimson Center that warned of an ambivalent US attitude towards China's role in Myanmar's civil war. And I can quote from this article. They say the US can no longer afford to view Myanmar as a boutique problem. The coup has unleashed tremendous chaos in Myanmar and regional instability and poses a threat to the US national interests in strategic competition with China, including the promotion of democracy and the protection of human rights. My question to you is, do you also consider the civil war in Myanmar to be a national threat to the United States of America because of the rivalry that exists between the US and China?
Well, that is obviously not for me to say. I'm not a US citizen, but I mean, if this assumption was true, then US policy has been very ineffectual, to say the least. I mean, if the whole proxy war thesis was right, why is there, and if Myanmar really is this important battleground, I hate all this terminology, but whatever, in quotation marks, between the US and China, why, if it's so important, why is the US reducing its engagement rather than the opposite? That it doesn't add up, I don't think. I see very little evidence, if any, for that, especially now with the Trump administration in power. it's really not clear what their strategic outlook on Myanmar is at all. I mean, what we can see, like empirically, what we can observe is USAID closure, which has a huge impact on US quote unquote soft power in Myanmar. So and a negative impact at that, yeah, affected negatively provision of humanitarian aid by US and US supported NGOs, but also the education sector, funding for human rights organizations, and so on and so forth. We also saw, secondly, huge funding cuts for US-backed media outlets, Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, and others that were very, very critical of the junta, and that were basically some of the independent media outlets that definitely tried to cover the atrocities of the junta to also an international audience. So that's also, for the moment, huge cuts. So that's also gone. And then you also have the threat of a 40% tariffs as it stands currently from August. So if I'm not sure how this really adds up to this view that the US is really contesting China over who essentially exerts some sort of hegemony over in Southeast Asia, or let alone in Myanmar. I don't see it. I actually see the other tendency. I see increased withdrawal from the US by the US, and hence my argument. If you want to picture it as this kind of proxy war, then the US has been a very, very ineffectually engaging in that proxy war over the last years. So yeah, I don't buy it. I don't see this. I know the publication you talk about from the Stimson Center. I think it's a certain there's a certain argument is to be made, but I think empirically what we see and what we've seen, especially since the Trump administration is power, is actually the opposite in my view. Is basically incremental further withdrawal and further disconnect by the US.
Thank you for your opinion on this. I want to stay in the foreign relations and also want to ask Nin about the West, because the West, as always, is debating whether we should use, or the West, you say, Europe should use sanctions. The US has talked about suspending its trade agreement. And the European Union also introduced a new round of sanctions against officials of the military junta in Myanmar in October last year. So now that sanction discussions and debates are back on the table, there is sanctions against Myanmar on the one side, but it was also like debated if it would be a helpful strategy for like the international community to also sanction China for the support of the junta. What do you think about this debate?
It's a tricky question because like sanction in China, I don't really have like enough knowledge to talk about it. And then I am quite skeptical whether the West can afford to sanction China, at the cost of the rising prices in commodities. So that for Myanmar, Myanmar is no stranger to sanctions. The military knows how to survive them, and then they have done it before and they are doing it again. So after the democratic transition began, we hope that foreign direct investment would flood in, especially from the Western countries. But in reality, most foreign direct investment came from the region, like Japan, South Korea, China, Southeast Asia. The West was like cautious. And after the 2021 coup, many of these Western companies, along with some Japanese firms, pulled out. But it didn't end there. South Korean, companies, they remain in the country. Southeast Asian companies, they remain in the country, regardless of the political situation. So what's more significant, it's Chinese investment has continued to grow. China probably is the biggest economic winner in the post-coup environment. It has won a lot of projects, and then it has like deals from the government on like infrastructure projects to continue its road and belts initiatives, to continue to grow its like main businesses inside the country. So because the junta is isolated by the international community, so it has no one to turn to but to China. The junta trying to approach Russia, but Russia is too far away, so they eventually has to go back to China for support. And it tends to like natural resources sells to China. We have mentioned this earlier in our conversations. Take the case of rare earth minerals, for example. People often talk about China's dominance in rare earth production, but what's often overlooked is that China receives more than half of its rare earth supply from Myanmar. Since the coup, rare earth mining in northern Myanmar, like Kachin, has reportedly increased by 2/3. This gives like China a global market advantage, supporting the China supply chains, while Myanmar is being exploited quietly behind the scenes. Does Myanmar lose? Absolutely, but not in ways that hurts the generals. The real cost is like paid by the working class, by communities whose land is mined, whose rivers are polluted, and who see no benefit from these extracted deals. The elites and military officials remain largely ineffective by the sanctions. So here is the hard truth about Myanmar. As long as China benefits, sanctions on Myanmar are unlikely to work. Unless China is on board, or unless its own interests are threatened, economic pressure from the West won't touch the junta. Now, I'm not saying let's sanction China. I have no position to say that. That's not my point. I am just speaking as a citizen of a country that borders China and lives with the consequences of this imbalance. While I'm saying is that sanctions alone without Chinese corporations are ineffective, and we need to confront that reality in every international conversations about Myanmar. Without China on board, Myanmar cannot change dramatically. Thank you.
Just one question about this again. Then, are there only sanctions in place that are touching the junta officials, or are there also sanctions in place that touch you as a civil society?
Yes,
like that you feel or see in your daily life?
Yes, significant amounts of international factories are leaving the country. So a lot of people, ordinary citizens, are unemployed. Many have to move to other countries in Southeast Asia to look for jobs because we don't have jobs anymore. There are wars. So either you go to the army, the military, because we have the conscription laws. All the young individuals have to serve in the military. Or if you don't want to go to the military, then go to the resistance groups and then, confront the military. So these are the only options that they have left with because of the sanctions, because there is no other business or there is no other jobs for that. So that's an obvious factor for an ordinary person life in Myanmar. And second is that education. A lot of, looking back to like the Trump's ban on Myanmar citizens entering the United States. So even, like if a Myanmar wants to study abroad in the United States, for example, I have a friend who's got a scholarship to study in the US, but she couldn't get in because, we are not allowed to travel to the United States anymore. Trump bans on it. So these type of things are affecting Myanmar people, and then people probably might like stop pursuing the educations, and then now they have like very, very limited choices to do in their daily lives, and then that actually pushes Myanmar more towards like intensifying the civil wars.
Thank you so much for sharing these insights with us. I have one last official question to Mr. Hajduk. Then maybe we can also continue talking about your experiences in Myanmar. But still regarding to foreign relations, Mr. Hajduk is an expert on ASEAN countries. So I wanted to ask a question to you. How is ASEAN dealing with the conflict in Myanmar? Because I was reading that ASEAN was criticized in public that it has an inadequate response to the conflict in Myanmar, and it is feared that the conflict could divide the ASEAN as an organization structure even more. What is your assessment of this situation?
Yeah, I'd say that's a fair assessment, to be honest. I mean, I'd say that more than 4 years after the coup, and in Myanmar, ASEAN still struggles massively to address the crises from a regional point of view. I mean, there's the 5-point consensus, cessation of violence, constructive dialogue, special envoy facilitating mediation, humanitarian assistance, and then special envoy visit to Myanmar and engages with all conflict parties. I mean, this was the 5-point consensus. The junta signed it and then basically gave ASEAN the middle finger, like literally a day afterwards. And none of the 5 points have been implemented so far. So, and there's been not much else coming from ASEAN on this, from ASEAN as a regional body, I mean. Not much else coming forward at the strategic level beyond the 5-point consensus so far. So yes, I think it's a fair assessment to say ASEAN has been very ineffective, almost, I wouldn't say paralyzed, but definitely ineffective in addressing the issues in Myanmar. And because of this ineffectiveness, a new reality has emerged. There's this kind of parallel diplomacy by ASEAN member states or coalitions of the willing of ASEAN member states below the level of the regional body of ASEAN. And that, I think, the fact that these engagements are happening, especially Thailand, Cambodia, but also Indonesia, have at various points conducted engagements with the junta. Indonesia also with the junta and also opposition groups over time, because of the ineffectiveness of ASEAN to move forward, to bring any new momentum into the Myanmar issue. So I think some of these initiatives by ASEAN member states have been constructively kind of supplementing ASEAN channels, but most of them actually have bypassed ASEAN and have actually laid bare the fact that there is little ASEAN coordination on the matter, and there's eroding coherence of ASEAN's collective response to Myanmar. And I think the next really divisive issue for ASEAN will be elections in 2026. Malaysia, for example, Singapore have already rejected this idea, have called them out as sham elections, questioned their legitimacy. And then on the other hand, you have ASEAN member states like Cambodia who have basically gone along with China on this and supported the idea of holding elections in Myanmar in 2026. So there you can already see the next kind of divisive issue on the horizon that will even further, in my view, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think it is very likely, it's very plausible that this will further erode ASEAN unity on the matter and further marginalize ASEAN's role in this.
Thank you so much. At this point, actually, right now I would go over to the questions of the participants, which are not in the Q&A box yet. So I encourage our participants to ask questions once our experts are still here. But until maybe one or two questions are reaching us, we could ask Nin for a couple of questions or for your experience, since it's really interesting that you're living in Myanmar. Maybe you can share with us how it is to live in Myanmar and in the civil war right now, or if there are like special matters that you would like to touch upon and share with us. Yeah, maybe you have some experiences to share.
For me, I grew up under the dictatorship, like during like Ban Shui administration, the previous dictator. But the experience are quite different. Right now, it's like it's more challenging to survive day-to-day life, because like freedom of expressions very, very limited, and there are a lot of uncertainties around. I have to like watch out who I mingle with, what I say, and what I discuss with people, especially on social media as well. So when you post something, even the black, profile, for example, the black color profile, sometimes can send you to prison. So one of the, like the key journalist, John Minsay, basically, he is also FNF alumni, was arrested because he changed his profile from like his picture to the black, because the hunter has the aerial attacks on his home village. So these type of actions on social media sometimes can like send you prison. So the freedom of expressions is like very, very limited, and then it's extremely dangerous to post it on social media. So a lot of people, with the fear of like being arrested, they self-censor. So they don't talk anything anymore. So they remain silent. They talk about other things, non-political things. This type of things are quite a different experience, and it's quite challenging for me to adjust to, because I used to be like very outspoken, and then I want to like criticize things, but nowadays I couldn't. And that's a biggest challenge for me. And then the second thing is like a lot of people, we have like the civil disobedience movement still going on. So a lot of people don't go to schools anymore. And then those young people, they don't know what to do. They stole their educations, they don't know what to do, and they couldn't get a job because they are the CDMs. These type of things, are not eye pleasing to see, because it happens around me all the time. And and when the earthquake came in, it was probably the worst moment. I live in Yangon, so my area was not affected, but other parts like Sagaing, for example, it's hugely impacted. But Sagaing is a resistant stronghold, so we couldn't really travel there and then send the emergency supplies in time. So a lot of people die because of the lack of the emergency aids. These type of things happen daily, and in the end, like we treat like bad news like, okay, this is sort of like the regular news to us nowadays. People die, so how many? These type of things, like we sort of like habituate the crisis nowadays. So these are quite challenging for me.
Thank you for sharing your experience with us. We also have a question in the Q&A box right now, and someone is asking if tourist visits should take place or should they be avoided out of solidarity with the opposition?
I've received these questions quite often, whether they shouldn't visit Myanmar or not. But I think a lot of local businesses are dying because there is no one visiting their places. So we just have like the local tourists. Like, not a lot of places in Myanmar are safe to travel anymore. So we have quite a limited access to tourist places. And then international visitors, probably from the West, are not coming, but Chinese visitors are there. Alongside Thai tourists as well. So regionally, there are a lot of tourists from like Russia, Eastern Europe as well, and Thailand, and also from China, of course. So they visit these places. But I will say it's your stance, whether to visit Myanmar or not. But not visiting Myanmar, does it show the solidarity with people inside the country? I doubt it. Because like people inside the country, they need to make businesses, they need to survive. And then without traveling, without having even local tourists or like international tourists, they have nothing much to do in some places. For example, like Inle, right now it's a deserted place because no one's visit there. They actually, make businesses with tourists. Nowadays, no tourists, go to their places, and then they have to close down their businesses. And then that's a loss for the local community. So if you don't want to engage directly with the military junta, it's good. But then, like, directly communicating and then making businesses with the locals, it's quite helpful, in my opinion, to the locals to survive and to manage, day-to-day crises and struggles.
Thank you. This was our only question in the Q&A box. I would ask Mr. Hajduk if he still wants to add something on all the things that you have just brought up, Nin, or if there's something that Mr. Hajduk also wants to share on this.
Maybe just from a researcher's point of view, that the access to information and data from Myanmar has become so tricky for researchers in Europe and I think around the world, actually, in this context of very, very little. And this also kind of links up with the tourism question. Very, very little international access, especially from Europe and from the US, Australia, and others to Myanmar. And this is really a problem. It's really great having Nin here and hearing her thoughts, and I really appreciate you sharing all these insights with us. I think it's really helpful because for us, we're basically, to be honest, relying on very much secondhand information often, and everyone's also, I think, well aware that all the data the junta publishes is murky, to say the least. Yeah, it's usually heavily manipulated. It's not super trustful, to put it mildly. So I think it is really, really important to not lose sight of what's going on in Myanmar, and to keep engaging at academic level, at civil society level, and potentially also at tourist level. And yeah, these are basically my thoughts on the matter.
Thank you. And I thank both of you a lot for like sharing your knowledge and also your experiences with us on this topic. I'm happy that we've talked about this topic so it doesn't just disappear from public discussions just because other things are happening in the world. So for now, it's just up to me to say thank you and wish you a very nice evening for the rest of the day. And I hope we will see each other again at some point in another event, maybe at Friedrich Naumann Foundation. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Heidrich and Jessica.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.